So this year, we have a very special event coming up. It's the Summer Olympics. And this year, it's going to be in Paris, France. Now, I don't know about you, but I've always loved the Olympics. It doesn't matter what sport it is, but I'm glued to the TV. It could be track and field, it could be swimming, it could be canoeing. It doesn't matter to me. I'm glued to the TV. I want to see as much of an Olympic action as I can. People are on the biggest stage in all of sports, competing for what is arguably the greatest athletic prize of all, the Olympic gold medal. There have been famous teams throughout the years in the Olympics that have made history. There was one particular team that I've definitely enjoyed. Now, I personally was not alive when this team was formed, and it wasn't even in the Summer Olympics. It was actually during the Winter Olympics. And it happened in the year of 1980. Now, I don't know if any of you already figured out the team I'm referring to, but it's the 1980 USA Men's Olympic Hockey Team. Coached by the famous Herb Brooks, he assembled a team of college-age boys to square off against some of the greatest teams in the world. Now, one of the biggest challenges that Herb Brooks had to face was all these college-age kids. Well, they are now on the same team with some of their former rivals. In fact, some of the players that Herb Brooks selected to be on this national team were some of the players he had when he coached at the University of Minnesota, as well as some players from Boston University, which those two teams face off in the national championship. And it wasn't exactly the greatest and nicest of rivals. So Herb Brooks had to bring a team who hated each other to work together, to be friends, to be united. But on top of that, they had to square off against the toughest team in the world, the Soviet Union, who had won the last 4 Olympics. Everyone deemed them to be completely unstoppable. In fact, the Soviet Union squared off against the NHL's all-star team, the best of the best of the best. And the Soviet Union beat the NHL All-Stars 6-0. So Herb Brooks had a lot on his plate. The Olympics arrived in 1980, and these college-age boys finally realized that they had to work together instead of against each other. And they started winning games left and right, defeating these higher-ranked teams that thought they were going to destroy the United States boys team. And then finally, the United States squared off against the Soviet Union in the Olympics. The winner of this game were to play for the gold medal. The Soviet Union in the first 5 games scored over 50 goals. That's an average of 10 goals per game. The US men's team, well, it was a lot less. But they were still competitive in winning games. And after 3 periods of hockey, the United States won their game against the Soviet Union 4-3. This game was to be known as the Miracle on Ice. In fact, Sports Illustrated even had a picture of the United States men celebrating this great victory. But what's something unique about this particular cover that Sports Illustrated did, there was no other words used on this cover other than the words Sports Illustrated, the date, and the barcode. That's the impact that this game had on the world. Team USA went on to play Finland for the gold medal, which they got. Personally, I don't think there's any other team in history that's impacted the world like they did. And today we're going to be looking at another team. This is not an Olympic team that we're going to be taking a look at, but we're looking at Nehemiah chapter 3, where we're given a list of names and assignments. People who came together and joined together. They knew that they were going to have a lot of work to do, a lot of difficult work, but they came together for one purpose: to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Now, what's something unique is that in chapter 3 of Nehemiah, if you read it, it's very different compared to other parts of scripture. It doesn't it's not exactly the same as others, you know. It's pretty much just a list of names and what they did and like what they built and where they were building. And some people might say, like, why is this important? Is this still applicable to us today? And after reading this, personally, I say absolutely. There are multiple lessons that we can get from this one chapter in Nehemiah. So before we get into Nehemiah 3, I want us to do a little bit of review from the last two chapters that we've gone through. So in chapter 1, we find the author, Nehemiah, who's located in the city of Susa, which is the capital of Persia, where he is the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. And one day he was visited by his brother as well as other people from Judea. They informed Nehemiah that the walls of Jerusalem have been destroyed, that they are still in disgrace. They are shameful. People are living in shame. And from this news, Nehemiah mourned, fasted, and prayed to God. He prayed to the God and how great of a God that he worships. And then talked about how the Israelites had sinned. He even mentioned he himself had sinned. And he then prayed to God for favor as he goes before the king to go help Jerusalem. And then last week in chapter 2, we see Nehemiah go up to the king to ask for favor, to ask for a good favor to go to Jerusalem to rebuild these walls. And not only did Nehemiah get permission to go rebuild the walls, but the king also gave him letters for safe passage as well as materials to build the wall. And Nehemiah got back to Jerusalem and he found that, yeah, these walls were definitely in disgrace. They were shameful. Everyone was pretty much living in rubble. But Nehemiah encouraged the people of Jerusalem to start rebuilding the walls together, to no longer live in disgrace. And the majority of people of Jerusalem said, yes, let's do it. Let's rebuild these walls. But not everyone was happy about this. There were a few people who said, no, let's not do this. They were even mocking and making fun of the people who were building the walls. And so then Nehemiah came in and said, okay, guys, if you don't want to rebuild these walls, that's fine, but you'll have no share. You'll have no portion of Jerusalem when these are built, pretty much banishing them from Jerusalem. And so now we are in chapter 3. And again, I've talked about how there's just a bunch of names here. So how is this important? Well, we're going to see how important this chapter is. Now, we're not going to be going verse by verse necessarily today, but there's 3 big things that we find today. The first one is you see, what was the work? What was the work going on in this section? Obviously, we've talked about this. It's the city walls. See, the city walls are important because number one, it helps with a defensive way to protect the city. It's a way that the city can be protected from attack. But also by having walls, it kind of keeps everyone on alert, keeps everyone alert and understanding of what is going on outside of the walls. Now, during this time, people understood that this is not exactly going to be an easy project. This is construction work here. This is not something that's going to take maybe a day or two. This is going to be a long, drawn out project. And so people were still encouraged and they said, okay, I'm willing to work. But one of the biggest problems that Nehemiah had to face was that this project was very spread out. Remember, it's going to be rebuilding the city walls. It's not just one section, it's the entire city. In fact, little help here. There on the back of your handouts, there's a map. There's a map of what Jerusalem would have looked like during this time. So for those online, I'm just going to share the screen for you so you can also see this map. All right. So we see there's that black line with Jerusalem. That's the city that we're talking about here. That's what Nehemiah most likely built. There's the bigger portion to the left side as well as more to the north, but that's more later on in scripture. But we're focusing on that darker lines there. And if you look at the measurements at the top, where it gives you like the dimensions of how far things are, it goes up to about 400 yards as well as 400 meters. And so doing these measurements, we see that Nehemiah had to work with a city that's about 800 yards long and maybe 100 yards wide in its widest section. And so this is not exactly going to be a simple project. In fact, there's going to be multiple workstations too. So think of your workspace being 8 football fields long. I want you to think about that. Do you think you can keep everything in order? You can keep an eye on everything at the same time? It would be very difficult. But also with multiple workstations, that means Nehemiah had to make sure everyone was okay at the exact same time. And throughout scripture, we see all the different gates, all the different towers, all the different sections of the wall. And so it's going to be very difficult to make sure everyone was safe and okay and had enough materials and everyone was still working. And also, like, making sure that no one's slacking off. Because, like the typical time where it's like, oh, the boss isn't here, so I'm just, yeah, I'm going to look like I'm working, but I'm not, But that was another obstacle Nehemiah had to face. But one thing he did have an advantage of is that people were going to be working on their homes, their like a place where they can be safe. In fact, 4 times in this chapter, and we see people working on their homes where it even refers to their homes or their living quarters. We see this in verse 10, verse 28, 29, and 30, where people are working on their homes or at least near their homes. And so this was great for Nehemiah because there's a few reasons why. Number one is that people do not have to take time to travel to their workstation. I want you to just take a look at the map really quick here. Let's just to say, for an example, your home was near that southern portion, and you should probably see the phrase the dung gate or the fountain gate. Say your home is in that section, but your workstation was all the way up at the north section near the fish gate, or like in those other sections there. And so, like an 800-yard trek every morning and every evening before and at the end of work. Yeah, that's going to take a lot of time. That's going to take a lot of time, a lot of energy. And so Nehemiah said, nope, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to make people be walking a lot. I'm just going to keep them near their homes. But also, it was a time frame for people to recover faster. So think about this. Even today, if you had to drive 15 minutes to work instead of driving an hour to work, that means it's only 15 minutes back. And so if you only have to drive a shorter distance, that means you can get home quicker and you can start recovering quicker. So there's more recovery time. And with construction, it's a lot more than just mental work. It's a lot of physical work. So your bodies are going to be sore, worn out. And so if your body can recover sooner, it can start recovering sooner, then it could be better for you the next day. But also, what's very important, Nehemiah realized, is that he wanted to make sure that people didn't leave their workstation if they were under attack. Because here's the thing. Now let's go back to that example from before. Like if your home was in the dung gate or the fountain gate, but your workstation was then in the fish gates, and if you were attacked, like near that fish gate, would you stay and defend Jerusalem, or would you want to make sure your family's safe? Personally, I would want to make sure my family is safe. So it's like I'm booking it back to my family, making sure that they're safe, but then that means the city is vulnerable for attack. But if I'm near my family and my workstation, it's like, why do I need to leave? I will stay here and defend my family and my city. So Nehemiah realized he could have both aspects be defended, both the family and the city at the same time. So that was the work that was meant to be done. And I'm just going to stop the share for online. There we go. Awesome. So that was our first point. That was the work that needed to be done. The second thing, it's who is working, who worked on this wall. And we see so many names here. A lot of them are really difficult to pronounce. But it's not necessarily the names of the individual people, it's their title or who they are, the description of them. In fact, in the very first verse of Nehemiah 3, what do we see? Elisha, the high priest, and his fellow priests. Interesting, isn't it? The high priest is doing construction work. Sometimes we've seen in the New Testament where the priests or the high priest, they deem themselves more worthy, more important than just common Israelites. But here, the high priest said, I'm going to work. I will do this work. In fact, we see this multiple times. We see the priest mentioned in verse 1 and verse 22, where we see the repairs next to him were made by the priests. And then again in verse 28, they were mentioned here once again. Above the horse gates, the priests made repairs, each in front of his own house. Where we see that again, where in front of his own house. It's very interesting also to see the high priest is mentioned the very first verse, probably as a emphasis of There's no higher power necessarily. It doesn't matter what your rank is. People are going to work. But we also see other rulers mentioned in here. We see in verse 12 and 19, we see the different rulers. In fact, in verse 12, we see a ruler of a half district of Jerusalem. He made repairs. In verse 19, let's see, where is verse 9? There it is. We see a ruler of Mizpah. Next to him, Izar, son of Jeshua, ruler of Mizpah. He made repairs on another section. So rulers got to work. It doesn't matter about the ranking. It doesn't matter who's important. People went to work. Difficult work. And also we see it wasn't just men, it was women who also did work on the wall. We see this in verse 12. Once again, we're going to that section again. So we see the ruler of the half district of Jerusalem repair the next section with the help of his daughters. See, Nehemiah didn't contact HR and say like, hey, how many women do we need to have on this project so that we're not in trouble with the government here? Like, is there a ratio, like a 3-to-1 type? It's like, no, it's just, hey, go to work. That was it. Men, women, it doesn't matter. Just needed a pair of hands to help work. But on top of that, it wasn't just like just random people. As great as help as this is, sometimes it's like you need to have some people who know what they're doing, who have skills, who have the ability to understand like how to work with tools. And we see craftsmen involved here. We see this in verse 8 as well as verse 32. We see the words goldsmith being mentioned here. Again, that's in verse 8 as well as verse 32. Goldsmiths being mentioned here. People who understand how to make tools, how to use them, to be safe. And so, like I said, it's great to have bodies to come and help, but if they don't know what they're doing, it's almost pointless, right? Like a little example, back when I was in college, when I was playing soccer, we had a couple members on our team that had never played the game before, but they wanted to be a college athlete. So it's like, great, fantastic. Well, yeah. Thing is that because they never played the game of soccer, it's like we're in college here. It's like for me by that time I had been playing for 10 years, and it's like these guys, it's like, oh boy, we might as well have been playing like youth soccer with their skills. But it was great that they helped because we were able to at least have a full roster, but it was more harm than good in a way. So by having at least some people who understand what they were doing, that was leadership. That was helpful. So then people can understand like, hey, this is how you hold a hammer. This is how you keep the walls sturdy instead of falling and other stuff. We also see people who weren't even from Jerusalem come and help out on the wall. For example, in verse 2, we see men from Jericho built the adjoining section. Men from Jericho. Now, this Jericho, it is nearby Jerusalem, but it is a couple, maybe a day or two walk from there, in a very difficult terrain as well, through the Judean wilderness, where nothing grows there. It's pretty much just rocky desert. But they came and helped on the wall. In verse 5, we see men of Tekoa come and helped make repairs. The next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa. And then we also see in verse 7, the next to them, repairs were made by men from Gibeon and Mizpah, Melatiah of Gibeon, and Jadon of Meroth. Like I said, there's a lot of names in here, so please forgive me on these names here. But it's people that didn't even live in Jerusalem, but they came and helped. So these are a lot of people here that come to help. Lots of different backgrounds, lots of different, maybe different age groups, different skills, different genders. People just came and worked on the wall. And then finally, we see the attitude of the work. So we saw what was the work, we just saw who worked, and now we're going to take a look at the attitude of the work. And sometimes we all know it's your attitude kind of dictates the type of work you do. If your attitude is good, then you have a good result. If your attitude is then you get a result. From all this list, and as well as the end of Nehemiah 2, we saw people were encouraged. They realized they had to make a change. They were encouraged. They said, let's build. And plus, Nehemiah, he wasn't too picky. He wasn't like, well, we need some people here, but we don't need all of you here. No, he just said, great, you want to help? Perfect. And everyone here had the same goal. They understood what they had to do to build the wall. Now, not everyone was happy with this idea. Not everyone wanted to work. In verse 5, we actually see this, as we talked about before. Verse 5, it says, this next section was prepared by the men of Tekoa, as we saw before. But the nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors. So yeah, as we saw, some people just don't want to work. Now, it's possible that these men knew of some of the others that ridiculed Nehemiah and the workers, as we saw at the end of Nehemiah 2. There were 3 men, and they were not happy of Nehemiah coming in and rebuilding the wall. And so these men of Tekoa, they probably just said, you know what, I don't want to get on these men's bad side here, so I don't want to work. And sometimes in ministry, it's like that. There are those rivalries that you don't want to step on people's toes. And it's sometimes just really difficult to make those decisions. And so, with all this coming together, how does this apply to us today? We see 3 things with our application. The first one is that everyone plays a part in ministry. There are positions and jobs that might not feel important. It might be like, I'm too good to do this. I don't want to do all this. I don't want to clean the bathroom, or I don't want to like work on the the windows, like cleaning them or dusting them, or I don't want to have to answer emails. I want to do ministry work. But all those parts are important when it comes to ministry. Everyone on the team is important. Everyone plays a part in ministry. It might not seem important, might not look important, but it is. Everyone plays a part in ministry. The second application today is that your rank doesn't exclude you from work. Your rank doesn't exclude you from work. Just because you might say like, oh, I'm the pastor, so that's not my job. That's not my job. No. No simple job is beneath anyone. I do know there are pastors out there, and I've seen them. They say, like, oh, no, that's not my job. I don't do the cleaning. That's somebody else's job. There was actually one pastor that I saw a couple years ago. It was at a church conference. It was my dad and Pastor Ken and myself. We all went to, and we spent the day there. And it was at this church that my dad and I knew, and we knew the pastor there, a great guy. And there was one trash can that was full. It wasn't smelly or stinky or anything like that, but it was full. And so there was a person who decided to change the trash to get a new trash bag. Guess who did the trash? Guess who took the trash out? It was the lead pastor. The lead pastor said, hey, the trash is full. I know where the bags are. I'm just going to take the trash out. Your rank doesn't exclude you from work. We even saw this throughout this chapter here. We saw priests, rulers decide to go and work in construction. Work that might seem beneath them. But they said, we will help. And then finally, all work is meaningful in ministry. All work is meaningful in ministry. There have been so many different things that we've started to do here at church, haven't there? For example, the coffee and the pastries that we've had in the back. That work is meaningful. Which thanks again, John, for taking care of that coffee. It's been great. It's fantastic. And multiple people have been bringing in different pastries and desserts and treats. All of that is meaningful work. Now, I've seen sometimes where people might say, like, oh, well, it's not really anything much. Like, I just picked it up on the way to church, and it's great. It's all meaningful. Cleaning the toilets is meaningful. Wiping down the pews, making them all new and shiny is meaningful. Getting the mail is meaningful for the church. All of that is important. I know sometimes it feels like we might not be doing much in ministry. I still remember when I was younger, it's like, am I doing enough in ministry? Is what I'm doing important? Even when I was at the camp, my job was the office guy. I was the guy in the office all the time. I was on the phones, on the computer, making sure all the different groups and retreats were all taken care of. But there were days where, yep, I scrubbed toilets. There were days during the winter I was shoveling snow. And sometimes those times I was shoveling snow, it was at 5 a.m. And I asked myself, is this meaningful? Am I making a difference? But I realized that it doesn't matter what the work is, all work in ministry is meaningful. And so, as we look to help this ministry, let's have the same attitude that the people in Jerusalem had, where they said, I want to help. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to do it, but I want to help. They weren't worried about their skills. They weren't worried about performance. They just said, hey, let's get to work. And I pray for all of us here to have that same mindset. Let us pray.